So this absolutely magnificent military tactic here is the schiltron, a compact body of spears that provided excellent defence against a heavy cavalry charge. The schiltron was a tactic mainly used by the Scottish during the Scottish Wars of Independence in the late 13th century, early 14th century, and we get our first mention of it in the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. The schiltron that Wallace used was circular shape, which provided an excellent static defence. It was made up of spearmen shoulder to shoulder in deep ranks, facing the circumference of the circle with all their spears slanted outwards. The massive spears extruding from the schiltron gave it a frightening hedgehog-like appearance, and sharpened stakes could even be placed in front of it to further their defensive position. However, the schiltron had one giant weakness, which Wallace found out at Falkirk. The Scottish cavalry had fled at first sign of contact, leaving the schiltrons isolated to get absolutely decimated by the English and Welsh archers. The Scots, who had already had their ranks thinned by brutal cavalry charges, now stood their ground with immense discipline which Wallace had installed into them as rains of arrows fell onto them. The archers had an absolute field day, with one contemporary account stating that the Scottish bodies covered the ground as thickly as snow in winter. King Edward then sent his heavy cavalry in to clean up the rest of them. So this magnificent beast here is the Hellburner, a specialised fireship used by the Dutch in the Siege of Antwerp that has been described as an early weapon of mass destruction. Now, the concept of setting ships on fire to use as a weapon was not new, as the ancient Greeks had pushed fireships towards the enemy to create havoc, but the introduction of gunpowder and advancements in ship construction now gave these fireships immense destructive potential. In 1584, during the 80 Years' War, the Spanish besieged Antwerp and built this bridge between Antwerp and the sea, closing off the city's waterways in an aim to starve them out. An Italian engineer named this I can't pronounce promised to destroy the bridge if the Dutch gave him 3 merchant ships. However, the Dutch were hesitant on how effective his plan would actually be, so only gave him 2 ships, one called Fortune and one called Hope, which were a lot smaller than expected, but he still managed to turn them into 2 of the biggest bombs Europe had ever seen. Each ship was fitted with a 40 by 16 foot fire chamber that could contain 7,000 pounds of gunpowder, surrounded by material that was extremely destructive in shrapnel blasts. The Fortune had a regular delayed fuse, but the Hope was an engineering marvel. Our Italian engineer had a clockmaker make him a mechanical timer combined with a flintlock mechanism to strike the gunpowder at the exact right time, making it history's first time bomb. On the night of the 4th of April 1585, the Dutch sent 30 fireships towards the Spanish bridge to divert their attention away from Fortune and Hope. Fortune ran aground the riverbank before fizzling out at the Spanish ships. However, Hope ran its course, and the explosion must have felt like God's wrath striking down on the Spanish as 7,000 pounds of gunpowder exploded. The explosion instantly killed 800 Spanish soldiers and ripped through around a quarter of their barricade. Shrapnel rained down the sky from miles away, and the explosion could be heard from up to 80 kilometres away as it flattened all the houses in close proximity. The Dutch were probably not expecting an explosion of such capacity and failed to capitalise on the Hellburner success, and the Spanish quickly rebuilt their barricade before taking Antwerp only 4 months later. So Henry V's victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 is one of the most iconic triumphs ever achieved on the battlefield, as roughly 6,000 starving and outnumbered men under the English banner defeated the might of French chivalry, numbering up to 15,000 or even higher, in an absolute massacre. But what happened in the immediate aftermath of the battle? The scale of the French defeat was absolutely frightening, and now thousands of French lay dead or dying on the battlefield, with it impossible to tell the exact number of their losses, with some sources saying up to 6,000, with a further 1 to 2,000 taken prisoner. Some regions saw an entire generation of French nobility wiped out, and in comparison, the English losses only numbered into the hundreds. Henry stood victorious on the battlefield, likely giving a speech to his men, thanking them for their courage and to acknowledge that their victory was down to God and God alone, and it was a sure sign of justice for his cause to take the French crown. The French were quick to point fingers with the Burgundians and Armagnacs, 2 rivaling parties who had joined for this battle, saying that each one had betrayed the other, as well as French knights being too arrogant to accept help from those socially below them. Chroniclers of the time were keen to point out how little time the battle took, with some saying half an hour to put the full French army in flight, and others saying it was probably around 3 hours, which is more likely. As was custom at the time, the bodies of the most valuable English dead were taken and boiled, so the bones could be removed and taken back to England for burial. However, the rest would not receive such a Christian burial and likely burn in nearby buildings. The English victors pulled out any Frenchmen still alive that were worth value from the heap of bodies and took them prisoner, whereas the rest were probably killed with a knife to the throat or an axe to the head. The French were stripped of any valuables including armour, clothing and jewellery, prizes of war which were sold as a profit, and now thousands lay dead in the muddy fields of Agincourt, naked as the day they were born. It rained again heavily that night, and Henry decided that his army would rest and gather their strength, with the French baggage train providing plentiful rations after weeks of almost starving to death. Some sources say that Henry was waited on by French prisoners that night, and he preached to them that it was not an English victory, but the work of God, as they had greatly sinned, and he was surprised they had not fared worse. The next morning, Henry awoke early to walk across the battlefield and observe thousands of dead men before ordering his troops to move out on their 45-mile march to Calais. He arrived in London on November the 16th and was received as a hero. So this absolutely magnificent beast here is Da Vinci's fighting vehicle, the precursor to the modern tank and the fantastic idea of its namesake, Leonardo da Vinci. Plans for this war machine were originally drawn up in 1487, with the cone being made of a wood covering, reinforced with metal plating, and the slanted angle allowed for a deflection of enemy fire. It was fixed with a number of light cannons around the perimeter of it, and the wheels being powered by cranks to allow 360 motion of the vehicle. The machine was designed to be directly driven onto the battlefield, with 8 men operating the cranks to develop momentum, and it would strike fear into opposition armies and scatter their formations. However, there was one small problem with our man Leo's design. The powering cranks went in opposite directions, making forward motion impossible. Of course, such a basic engineering flaw such as this would never escape the detailed mind of Da Vinci, so scholars believe he intentionally sabotaged his own design as he was a pacifist at heart. Another theory is that if the plans got into enemy hands, they wouldn't be able to construct a working vehicle, and they'd need Da Vinci there to help them build it. It's likely that it wouldn't actually have worked, however, as the cannons would have made it far too heavy to actually move. Another one of Da Vinci's battlefield masterpieces is this bad boy here, the 33-barreled Organ of Death, as the name suggests, a form of artillery with 33 cannons on it. As gunpowder technology was still relatively new in Da Vinci's time, his Organ of Death aimed to fix 2 major problems that current artillery had: the slow rate of fire and massive inaccuracy. The cannons were split into 3 rotating groups of 11, where one would be firing, the other would be cooling down, and the last would be reloaded by the crew to allow for an increased rate in fire. The cannons were designed to be lightweight to allow for optimal battlefield movement, and with the wide field of shooting, it was perfect against advancing infantry, and still with the inaccurate cannons at the time, with 11 barrels, you're bound to hit something. Unfortunately, it was another one of Da Vinci's inventions that never made it past the drawing table, and he later sized it down to a smaller one with just 11 barrels, which still didn't make it past the drawing table. It seems like Da Vinci was ahead of his time though, as his 33-barreled organ gun of death and destruction was the precursor to early volley guns and machine guns. So one of the greatest revolutions to hit the medieval battlefield was of course the introduction of gunpowder, a chemical mixture which allowed for deadlier and more explosive weaponry, although highly inaccurate to begin with, that changed the course of warfare forever. Gunpowder almost certainly originated in China, with the first written chemical formula for it being found around 1040 AD, after centuries long worth of alchemy experimentation. A chemical mixture of sulphur, charcoal and saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, made up the basis of gunpowder, with around 6 to 7 parts of saltpeter compared to 1 part of sulphur and charcoal, making the best explosive mixture so it wouldn't just fizzle out. Saltpeter had been available to the Chinese since around the 1st century AD and was used for various medical treatments, but it took another 800 years before early forms of gunpowder started to be mentioned. The invention of gunpowder is thought to have been a byproduct of Chinese alchemists searching for a mixture to create an elixir of life to make you live forever. However, the invention of gunpowder and what weapons it was used for certainly didn't make you live that long. Of course, it didn't take too long for gunpowder to start appearing on the battlefield, creating new and exciting ways to kill people in the form of incendiary projectiles, bombs, and early form of guns, and the word on the street of this new wonder weapon soon began to spread west. Europe, though, had very few nitrate deposits to create the main ingredient of saltpeter, so had to rely on Chinese imports, making it extremely expensive and in limited supply, and it soon became known as Chinese snow. In 1346, before his Cressy campaign, King Edward III of England ordered around 900 pounds of saltpeter and 800 pounds of sulphur for the King's gunniss, with the Battle of Cressy being one of the first major battles in Europe where gunpowder weaponry was used. The amount Edward ordered, though, wouldn't be enough to make the adequate mixture of gunpowder, so it's unsure at this time whether proportions were still being messed with, or he just used things from supplies he already had. What gunpowder weaponry employed at Cressy is uncertain from contemporary accounts, but it probably looks something like this, with it having little impact on the actual battle, but it probably gave men and horses alike a good scare with the thunderous roar of the shooting. The late 14th century saw Europe develop techniques to increase the combustion of gunpowder by drying it into small clumps, as well as methods to extract vast quantities of saltpeter without the need for importation, meaning the price of gunpowder in around 50 years fell 80%. While the 14th century saw gunpowder measured in around hundreds of pounds, the 15th century now saw it measured in thousands of pounds, and during the 55-day siege of Constantinople, the cannons used by the attackers were consuming around 1,000 pounds of powder a day.